Speaker, if I was a dictator and I knew that the dictator before me got immunity at the end of his reign, would I only kill 10 people, or would I know that I could get away with killing 100? I'd probably kill 100. Would I only embezzle, $10 million, or would I embezzle $100 million? Because I knew that at some point in the future I would get immunity for my actions. What this bench has failed to recognise is that there's no time limit on the operation of a dictator. The dictators can continue to operate, especially longer and in worse behaviour, when they know that there is immunity for them at the end of the path. It doesn't just flow into the up-and-coming dictator, but the individual operating dictator at that point in time has an incentive to be worse. What we want to bring you by way of extension today is that what we ultimately are trying to achieve at the end of this debate is some form of functioning democracy. What the model that this government has proposed not only doesn't achieve that, but in fact weakens the face of democracy for countries trying to establish it. Because what they remove from these situations is the dictator themselves, not the systems they've entrenched, not the ideologies they've entrenched, and not the militaristic rule that have existed so far in most of these countries. And I'd just like to point out, it's kind of funny, no one's mentioned Mugabe in this debate so far. We're going to bring you a little bit more on Mugabe on why that example most definitely falls to this side of the House. Firstly, 3 points in rebuttal. Firstly, the extension that we heard from Closey. They told us it's great that we get them out of power straight away. There was no time limit, ladies and gentlemen, but there's no absolute guarantee that these people are going to take it up instantly. And we've told you consistently that they won't. It will have the opposite effect. When you remove those fears, these people will want to stay longer. Tim told us in their model that you're allowed to keep your own wealth when you move into exile. That's an incentive to take more money out of the population before you take that amnesty. Also, what we would actually support on this side of the House is that sometimes having a dictator there, as bad as that is, breeds resentment within these communities and within these countries, which we think is very important for maintaining a stable democracy once they eventually are removed. We also heard basically the simplistic point like dictators are bad for the economy about Philippines. Firstly, not all dictators are. The GDP of Iraqi citizens under Saddam Hussein was $9,700. After he left, it was about $1,700. Obviously, because of other reasons as well, but some actually do have the interest of their economy, partly because they take a lot of money themselves, but they are not always necessarily bad for the economy. And furthermore, nascent democracies are not always exactly the breeding ground of investment and those kinds of things. We lastly heard that admitting guilt will remove the ideology. Firstly, given that we think these people are going to be around for a long time before they take this up, when they're admitting their guilt, they're going to be probably pretty old and frail. There'll be excuses made like, oh, he's just going insane for the next up-and-coming dictator. They'll probably dismiss that. But furthermore, the government just assumed that people aren't stupid, that because they're saying that it was voluntary, that people won't realise that they've been taken out of the country and they don't know where they are anymore. They will probably realise that they've been removed because of this offer of amnesty. Secondly, how is justice best achieved? Well, we heard basically that we're going to get some form of truth and reconciliation commissions to justify, to give justice to the victims. Firstly, we think that public sentiment, as you saw in Iraq and the falling of Saddam Hussein, probably wants more than apology. When you've been raped by someone and systematic, pillaging of towns, we don't think an apology is ever going to be as sufficient as knowing that that person died. Bronwyn told us that people die in the ICC and that's bad. These victims were probably more happy that the people were locked up in jail and eventually died instead of being in some holiday house in Mauritius. We also heard that people voluntarily stepping down removes issues regarding that. Well, firstly, we think that's actually not a good thing for the sentiment that you breed in regards to democracy, because you're not showing the victory of the West, or not necessarily the West, you're not showing the victory of democracy and popular sentiment over that individual when it looks like they've still won. They've still succeeded because they're choosing to step down. So we think that's bad. Lastly, in terms of, otherwise the only option we have is a military coup. When you remove a dictator, these militia groups are still active in these communities. The opposition groups are still active in these communities. We think it actually legitimises opposition practices that are more hardline and more willing to engage in violence. We furthermore think, that it weakens the face of democracy, and that's what I'm going to bring you now by way of extension. But first, I'll take Tim.
Madam, Robert Mugabe was an independence fighter for 30 years. He was a folk hero in the anti-apartheid movement, and he has an unparalleled patronage network. In contrast, his political party, ZANU-PF, is wildly unpopular. Removing him personally would almost guarantee
We don't think it's not just about one individual, it's about the culture within these communities. Zimbabwe has always been a community that favours military power. He is one example of that. When you remove that person, you still maintain that ideology, you still leave the structures behind, and someone else from ZANU-PF will just step up and take his place. How do you best instill democracy? We think democracy, at its very heart, needs to represent the will of the people. We see breeding resentment within Zimbabwe and the middle class in Zimbabwe, given the economic failures of Mugabe. We also see breeding resentment within the South African Development Committee when they're becoming increasingly hardline against Mugabe. We think this happens in two situations. Where they do have popular support of the people, it's seen as an imposition of democracy by the removal of the dictator. We think that's bad in the biggest face of democracy. Even if they don't, we think that democracy won't necessarily result because, as we said, the structures still remain, such as the military dictatorship, such as the military and tribal focus. We think that the natural evolution of democracy, which happens in places like Zimbabwe, places like Botswana rather, where you see a transition through the tribal focus and still remaining with the tribal elders, is a much more natural, organic process that breeds acceptance of democracy within these countries. We think furthermore an example of Indonesia, where the post-New Order election in 1999 following the Asian financial crisis, the election of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, still has remnants of military control, for example, through his appointment of Jogo Suyanto in controlling the military, but they still have managed the Aceh region much better, and they're improving in their control of that area because it happened naturally, because it wasn't an imposition of democracy. Furthermore, we think that the influence of these people will still remain when you remove them, not only through supporter groups and militia, but through the people that take their place. We think it legitimises the people that have supported their campaign, and if it doesn't, and it also leads to the stepping up to power in many cases of opposition groups. So when in these countries, it's not just the ruling parties that engage in bad behaviour, it's often the rebels in Sudan, it's the rebels in Zimbabwe that also induce hardship on other individuals. And we think that them taking power in these situations is just as bad because it legitimises the actions that they've gone through and doesn't lead to a better face of democracy. We also think, furthermore, it undermines all the work that's being done under the status quo by groups like the South African Development Community, by other people and individual neighbours like the President of Botswana in negotiating with these groups. We think it weakens their face and their negotiating power going further. What we think is better is that through economic instability, which they wanted to say was bad necessarily, is actually often the stimulus for change, like we saw in Indonesia, when we see the middle class begin to rally and actually lead to an organic influence of democracy, an imposition of democracy in these countries. That is why we are proud to approach.